The past, present, and future of the China-U.S. trade war. Introduction. The trade war between the United States and China has become one of the defining geopolitical conflicts of the 21st century. Rooted in decades of complex economic interactions, political maneuvering, and strategic competition, the trade war has evolved through various phases since its inception. This report explores the historical context, current landscape, and future implications of the China-U.S. trade war, drawing from insights provided by influential figures such as former President Jimmy Carter and business leader Ronnie C. Chan. Historical context and key events. Normalization of relations. The formal normalization of relations between the United States and China occurred in 1979 under President Jimmy Carter. This marked a significant shift in diplomatic ties, facilitating increased trade and investment between the two nations. The relationship flourished in the following decades, leading to mutual economic growth and job creation in the U.S. However, as China's economic power grew, tensions began to surface, especially regarding trade practices and intellectual property rights. Escalation of the trade war. A turning point came in the late 2010s, particularly during the Trump administration. The U.S. adopted a confrontational stance towards China, citing unfair trade practices, intellectual property theft, and national security concerns. In January 2019, the trade war escalated dramatically with the imposition of tariffs on billions of dollars of goods. This action marked the onset of a prolonged economic and political standoff characterized by retaliatory tariffs and increasing diplomatic friction. Bipartisan consensus. By 2021, the relationship had reached a low point, with a bipartisan consensus emerging in Washington that viewed China as America's most formidable national competitor. This perspective led to calls for a whole-of-government approach to counter perceived threats from China. The deterioration of relations raised concerns about the potential for military conflict, particularly regarding Taiwan, as both governments adopted increasingly aggressive postures. Current landscape. As of late 2024, the U.S.-China relationship remains fraught with tension. President Carter, reflecting on the current state of affairs, emphasized the importance of maintaining economic ties and cautioned against weaponizing trade issues. He noted that such actions could harm citizens in both countries, particularly in the agricultural sector, where American exports have been significantly impacted by tariffs. The role of political leadership. The upcoming 2024 U.S. presidential election is poised to influence the future of U.S.-China relations. Ronnie C. Chan discussed the implications of changing political leadership, suggesting that the political landscape in the U.S. could significantly affect trade policies and diplomatic efforts. He underscored the need for constructive dialogue and collaboration regardless of the election outcomes. Areas of cooperation. Despite the prevailing tensions, both Carter and Chan highlighted the potential for cooperation in addressing global challenges such as climate change, public health crises, and economic recovery. Carter emphasized that the U.S. and China should work together to mitigate global warming and improve public health, advocating for collaborative initiatives that could foster stability and progress. Future outlook. Looking ahead, the future of U.S.-China relations hinges on the ability of both nations to engage in constructive dialogue and cooperation. The insights from both Carter and Chan suggest that while competition will persist, there is also a shared interest in addressing global issues that transcend national borders. The need for engagement. Carter advocates for a renewed commitment to diplomacy and engagement, arguing that both countries must prioritize peaceful coexistence and mutual respect. He believes that by fostering economic cooperation, the U.S. and China can work towards a more stable and prosperous future for their citizens and the world at large. Chan echoed this sentiment, suggesting that regardless of political changes, the necessity for dialogue and collaboration remains paramount. He warned that failure to communicate effectively could exacerbate existing tensions and lead to unintended consequences. Potential for conflict. While both leaders express hope for a cooperative future, they acknowledge the risks of conflict, particularly concerning Taiwan and broader geopolitical considerations. As the U.S. grapples with its strategic interests in the Indo-Pacific, the potential for miscalculation remains a significant concern. Carter and Chan emphasize the importance of diplomatic channels to prevent conflict escalation and maintain regional stability. Conclusion. In summary, the U.S.-China trade war is a multifaceted issue that reflects historical developments, current economic conditions, and future geopolitical considerations. As the relationship continues to evolve, effective engagement and a commitment to addressing mutual concerns are essential for improving relations and fostering global stability. The insights from President Carter and Ronnie C. Chan serve as a reminder of the importance of cooperation in navigating the complexities of this critical bilateral relationship. The timeline of events from normalization in 1979 to the current trade war underscores the ongoing evolution of U.S.-China relations, highlighting the need for a balanced approach that considers both competition and cooperation as integral components of the future landscape. The U.S.-China trade war has been a significant point of tension in international relations, with its complexities often leading to counterintuitive insights. Here are several counterintuitive information points derived from the discussions around the past, present, and future of the U.S.-China trade war. 1. Perception of economic threat versus actual economic interdependence. While mainstream narratives frame China as an economic threat to the U.S., the reality is that both economies are deeply intertwined. For instance, despite trade tensions, a significant portion of American jobs and economic growth has been linked to trade with China. Many American companies rely on Chinese manufacturing for their supply chains. In fact, the trade war has highlighted the risk associated with decoupling. It could lead to economic losses in both countries, contradicting the notion that a trade war would solely benefit the U.S. economy. 2. Human rights versus economic engagement. There is a widespread belief that the U.S. should take a hard stance on human rights abuses in China to maintain moral integrity. However, former President Jimmy Carter suggests that engagement might actually lead to better outcomes for human rights. He posits that addressing fundamental human needs may pave the way for broader freedoms. This view challenges the notion that isolation and confrontation are the most effective means of promoting human rights, suggesting that a cooperative approach could yield better results. 3. Bipartisan consensus on competition versus need for cooperation. While there is a bipartisan consensus in the U.S. that characterizes China as a formidable competitor necessitating a confrontational stance, both Carter and Ronnie C. Chan argue for the importance of cooperation in addressing global challenges like climate change and pandemics. This stands in contrast to the prevailing narrative that emphasizes zero-sum competition, highlighting that mutual benefits can arise from collaborative efforts even amidst tensions. 4. Trade war's impact on American consumers. The conventional view is that tariffs are a means of protecting American jobs. However, evidence suggests that tariffs imposed during the trade war have led to increased costs for American consumers without significantly protecting jobs. The reality is that the burden of tariffs often falls on consumers, contradicting the assertion that such measures primarily benefit the domestic workforce. 5. A fear of military conflict versus historical restraint. Many analysts argue that the risk of military conflict between the U.S. and China is higher than ever, particularly regarding Taiwan. However, Carter emphasizes that both nations have historically prioritized peace and have managed to avoid direct conflict despite numerous flashpoints. This perspective counters the prevailing narrative of an inevitable military confrontation, suggesting that diplomatic priorities can prevail. 6. Focus on short-term gains versus long-term stability. Political leaders often focus on short-term electoral gains, which can drive aggressive trade policies. Yet both Chan and Carter advocate for long-term engagement strategies that consider future stability over immediate political expediency. This perspective challenges the reactive nature of current U.S. trade policies, suggesting that a long-term vision is crucial for sustainable relations. 7. Weaponization of trade and its consequences. The prevailing belief is that using trade as a weapon can yield immediate concessions from China. However, both Carter and Chan warned that this approach could backfire, leading to a deterioration of relations that harms citizens in both countries. This counterintuitive insight emphasizes that leveraging trade for political ends can destabilize broader economic relations. 8. China's view on economic growth versus political freedoms. Carter's insights reveal a counterintuitive understanding of Chinese leadership perspectives which prioritize economic stability and poverty alleviation over political freedoms. This view challenges the notion that economic growth will automatically lead to political liberalization, suggesting that different value systems can lead to divergent paths in governance and societal development. These points illustrate the nuanced and complex nature of the U.S.-China trade war, highlighting how deeply ingrained beliefs may not always align with the reality of international economic and political relationships. The ongoing dialogue surrounding these themes emphasizes the need for a more informed and strategic approach to U.S.-China relations that recognizes both the potential for conflict and the necessity for cooperation. The U.S.-China trade war has deep historical roots and complex implications that many may overlook. Here are several significant points to consider. 1. Historical significance of normalization. The normalization of relations in 1979 under President Jimmy Carter is a pivotal moment that set the stage for decades of cooperation and competition. This historical context is often simplified in discussions about the trade war, but understanding it is crucial. The normalization was not just a diplomatic maneuver, it opened up channels for economic interaction, cultural exchange, and mutual dependency that have shaped both nations' trajectories. Recognizing this history underscores the importance of diplomacy in resolving current tensions. 2. The role of bipartisan consensus. The current bipartisan consensus that views China as a primary competitor is significant. This shift in U.S. policy reflects a growing perception of threat rather than opportunity. The implications of this consensus are profound, as it suggests that any potential future administration may find it politically advantageous to maintain a confrontational stance toward China regardless of party affiliation. This could lead to a more entrenched and escalatory trade war with fewer opportunities for constructive dialogue. 3. Economic interdependence. Many discussions about the trade war focus on tariffs and trade balances, but the deeper economic interdependence between the U.S. and China is often overlooked. For instance, the U.S. agricultural sector heavily relies on exports to China, which has been adversely impacted by the trade war. This economic interdependence highlights that the conflict is not just about numbers, it has real implications for American farmers and consumers. Recognizing this interdependence can foster a more nuanced understanding of the stakes involved in trade negotiations. 4. Human rights and trade policy. President Carter's insights on human rights emphasize that these issues cannot be divorced from trade relations. The idea that economic cooperation can lead to improvements in human rights conditions is a perspective that deserves more attention. The tendency to treat trade and human rights as separate issues can lead to missed opportunities for leveraging economic ties to promote broader social goals. Understanding this connection can inform more holistic policy approaches. 5. Geopolitical risks. The potential for military conflict over Taiwan is a significant but often abstract concern in discussions about the trade war. Carter's perspective that both nations prioritize peace points to a mutual desire to avoid conflict. Yet this does not negate the real risks involved. The framing of Taiwan as a flashpoint illustrates the high stakes of U.S.-China relations, where trade tensions can escalate into military confrontations. This risk is often understated in economic analyses but is critical for comprehensive risk assessments. 6. Global cooperation on shared challenges. The dialogue suggests that despite tensions, there are areas where U.S.-China cooperation is not only possible but necessary, such as in addressing climate change and health crises. Many analyses focus on competitive aspects, neglecting the potential for collaboration on global issues that affect both countries and the world at large. Acknowledging the need for cooperation can foster a more positive outlook on the relationship and encourage initiatives that benefit both nations and beyond. 7. The influence of upcoming elections. The implications of the 2024 U.S. presidential election on U.S.-China relations should not be underestimated. Political shifts can dramatically alter the landscape of trade policies and diplomatic approaches. The uncertainty surrounding electoral outcomes can lead to volatility in trade relations, which could have lasting economic impacts. Observers often concentrate on current policies without considering how the electoral cycle can influence future U.S.-China dynamics. 8. Long-term perspectives on engagement. President Carter's emphasis on the need for sustained engagement over time is crucial. In a rapidly changing geopolitical environment, the tendency to react hastily to immediate challenges can overshadow the importance of long-term strategy. A focus on engagement and understanding rather than confrontation can lead to more sustainable solutions. This patient approach often gets lost in the urgency of current events but is essential for lasting peace and cooperation. In conclusion, the U.S.-China trade war is a multifaceted issue that extends beyond immediate economic concerns. Recognizing the deeper historical, political, and social contexts can lead to a more informed and nuanced understanding of the challenges and opportunities that exist in this critical bilateral relationship. 1. Historical context and evolution of relations. The U.S.-China trade war has deep roots in the normalization of relations in 1979, which marked the beginning of a complex bilateral relationship characterized by both cooperation and competition. Initially, trade and investment resulted in economic growth for both nations. However, tensions escalated, particularly in the late 2010s, as the U.S. adopted a confrontational stance under the Trump administration, citing unfair trade practices and national security issues. Understanding this historical trajectory is crucial for analyzing the current landscape and future implications. 2. Current landscape and bipartisan consensus. As of 2021, there is a bipartisan consensus in the U.S. that views China as a significant national competitor, with calls for a whole-of-government approach to counter perceived threats. This consensus reflects a shift from the earlier engagement strategy. President Carter highlighted the importance of maintaining economic ties despite these tensions, emphasizing that weaponizing trade could have detrimental effects on citizens in both nations. The current landscape underscores a critical juncture for U.S.-China relations, where both cooperation and competition coexist. 3. Future outlook and the role of leadership. Both President Carter and Ronnie C. Chan emphasized the need for renewed engagement and constructive dialogue moving forward. They argue that global challenges such as climate change and health crises necessitate collaboration between the U.S. and China. The political landscape, particularly the implications of the 2024 U.S. presidential election, could significantly influence future trade policies and diplomatic efforts. This future outlook highlights the precarious balance of addressing competitive interests while fostering cooperative initiatives. 4. Common ground and diverging perspectives. A key theme in the analysis is the recognition of the intertwined economic relationship between the U.S. and China, which offers potential for mutual growth. However, there is a divergence in perspectives regarding the immediate future. Chan focuses on the political ramifications of upcoming elections, while Carter emphasizes the historical context and the need for sustained engagement. This divergence illustrates the complexity of navigating the U.S.-China relationship, where differing priorities can impact bilateral cooperation. These points provide a comprehensive framework for an in-depth analysis and discussion of the U.S.-China trade wars, past, present, and future, emphasizing the critical elements that shape this pivotal global relationship. 1. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act 1930. This was one of the most notorious trade protection measures in U.S. history. The act raised tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods, leading to retaliatory measures from other countries and a significant decline in international trade. The consequences were dire. It is widely believed that the act exacerbated the Great Depression by stifling economic recovery and deepening global economic malaise. The backlash against protectionism highlighted the dangers of trade wars, a theme that resonates with the modern U.S.-China trade tensions. 2. The Opium Wars 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860. These conflicts between China and Western powers, particularly Britain, arose from trade imbalances and the illegal opium trade. The First Opium War led to the Treaty of Nanking, which imposed unfavorable terms on China, including cessions of territory and extraterritorial rights for foreigners. The Opium Wars are illustrative of how trade disputes can escalate into military conflict and have long-lasting geopolitical ramifications akin to the contemporary U.S.-China tensions over trade and technology. 3. The Section 301 trade action against Japan 1981. In the early 1980s, the U.S. accused Japan of unfair trade practices, particularly in the automotive and electronics sectors. The U.S. government invoked Section 301 of the Trade Act, allowing it to impose tariffs on Japanese goods to counteract perceived trade imbalances. This trade action led to significant diplomatic negotiations and agreements, ultimately resulting in Japan agreeing to voluntary export restraints. This case parallels the U.S.-China trade war in terms of addressing trade imbalances and the use of tariffs as a tool of economic policy. The U.S.-China trade war, which has evolved dramatically since its onset, is poised for further transformation in the coming years. Understanding the historical context, current dynamics, and future outlook of this conflict is crucial, as it significantly impacts global economics and geopolitics. Historical context. The U.S.-China relationship formally began in 1979 when President Jimmy Carter normalized diplomatic ties with China under Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping. This era was marked by mutual economic benefits and cooperation. However, the relationship began to sour in the late 2010s, particularly during the Trump administration, which highlighted issues like intellectual property theft and unfair trade practices. The initiation of tariffs in January 2019 marked a significant escalation, leading to a protracted trade conflict that affected various sectors across both economies. Current dynamics. As of 2021, the U.S.-China relationship has reached a low point, with a bipartisan consensus in Washington viewing China as a competitor rather than an ally. President Carter emphasized the importance of maintaining economic ties and cautioned against the weaponization of trade, which could harm citizens in both countries. Current tensions are compounded by political factors, including the implications of the 2024 U.S. presidential election on trade policies and diplomatic relations. Future outlook. Looking ahead, several predictions can be made regarding the trajectory of the U.S.-China trade war. 1. Continued competition and confrontation. The competitive nature of U.S.-China relations is likely to persist, especially concerning technology and trade. Both nations will continue to vie for dominance in sectors like semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and renewable energy. This competition may lead to further tariffs and trade barriers. 2. Bipartisan support for tough stance on China. Regardless of the outcome of the 2024 elections, a tough stance on China is expected to remain a fixture of U.S. policy. Both major political parties exhibit a consensus on viewing China as a significant threat to U.S. economic and national security interests. 3. Opportunities for cooperation. Despite the ongoing tensions, critical global challenges such as climate change, public health, and nuclear proliferation will necessitate cooperation between the U.S. and China. Collaborative initiatives in areas like sustainable development and pandemic response could emerge, reflecting a pragmatic approach to shared global issues. 4. Impact of global supply chains. The trade war has prompted many companies to re-evaluate their global supply chains. As businesses seek to mitigate risks associated with reliance on Chinese manufacturing, there may be a shift toward diversification. which could alter the economic landscape in both countries and beyond. 5. Regional alliances and security concerns. The strategic rivalry will likely extend into military and security domains, particularly concerning Taiwan and the South China Sea. Increased military posturing and alliances in the Asia-Pacific region could exacerbate tensions, with both nations seeking to bolster their influence. 6. Public sentiment and human rights issues. Domestic public sentiment in both countries will play a significant role in shaping future policies. U.S. concerns over human rights issues may complicate diplomatic engagements, while China's emphasis on sovereignty and non-interference could lead to stalemates in negotiations. 7. Long-term economic adjustments. Both economies may need to adapt to a new normal characterized by decoupling in certain sectors. This could lead to increased domestic production in the U.S. and a push for self-sufficiency in China, reshaping global trade patterns. In conclusion, while the U.S.-China trade war presents numerous challenges, it also offers potential avenues for collaboration on pressing global issues. The future will likely be characterized by a complex interplay of competition and cooperation, necessitating diplomatic finesse and strategic foresight from both nations. Effective engagement will be crucial to navigating the challenges ahead and fostering a stable global economic environment.